The only thing worse than a liar is a liar that's also a hypocrite. In 2021, the UK Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, was photographed engaging in an affair at the height of the recent public health crisis, to widespread outrage. The same lips that told us all to stay home and social distance were found well within 6 meters of a woman he was not married to, much to the probable chagrin of his wife. This was met with anger across the country for a pretty understandable reason. Not only was it a scandal, it was a clear example of hypocrisy. Hancock had told everyone else to socially distance when he was clearly not following the same rules. You arguably can't get less socially distanced than allegedly shagging someone. And this speaks to a wider phenomenon. Most people would agree that having an affair is probably worthy of condemnation. But it must be said, there are plenty of politicians who've had affairs in recent years, and they have not received the same level of opprobrium as Mr. Hancock did. The thing that came up time and time again in the papers was not just that he was allegedly sleeping around, but that he was a hypocrite for breaking the rules and guidelines that he personally recommended people follow. But why is it that hypocrisy strikes us as so irritating? And why do hypocrites hold a special place in hell as far as the court of public opinion goes? Well, that is just the question I seek to answer. Get ready to learn the different genres of hypocrite, what hypocrisy has to do with cowardice, and how a health secretary breaking their own guidelines could undermine the very foundations of public morality. As always, bear in mind I'm only looking at a small fraction of the literature on this topic that is out there, and this is just a video to aid in your own thinking, rather than some sort of completed and definite theory. But first, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of the issue, and ask, what actually is a hypocrite? 1. Hypocrisy, a user's guide. Hypocrisy is one of those terms that has a pretty intuitive definition that nonetheless could do with a bit of refining. At first glance, most people will give roughly the same definition. Hypocrisy is saying one thing and then doing another. It is a contradiction between someone's stated intentions and their actions, and so is a form of deception. However, by itself, I don't think this quite captures the specificity of a hypocrite. For instance, imagine that I said that I did not like jam and yet continued to eat jam sandwiches every single day for lunch. There is a sense in which I am being deceptive here. After all, I clearly do like jam enough to eat it every day. I display the behaviors of someone who likes jam, and so I am saying one thing and then doing another. However, this is unlikely to strike many people as hypocrisy. It is baffling, sure, and you may wonder why I've chosen to lie about this really arbitrary thing, but the word hypocrite doesn't seem quite right. And this is not just because whether or not I eat jam is a really trivial issue. For instance, one of my favourite Eastern Orthodox saints is Saint Vitalis. According to his legend, he would make a public display of hiring prostitutes every night and appeared to be making full use of their services. However, he was not sleeping with them at all, but rather giving them some respite from their unpleasant work by paying for them to simply rest while he prayed over them. If they were willing, he would work to arrange a safer place for them to be, and even encourage some monasteries to take them in. However, if the people running brothels knew this was his plan, then he would be barred from seeing any prostitutes, and so he kept this all a secret. It was only after his death that his good deeds were revealed, and he was eventually made a saint. Here we have a very different kind of saying one thing and then doing another. What Vitalis said was that he was using the services of prostitutes, and so implicitly saying that prostitution was a fine thing. However, what he did was work to help those who wanted to leave the profession, and never actually hired prostitutes for their sexual services. The usual reaction to the story of Vitalis is not to condemn him as a hypocrite, but to praise him, and maybe call him a little bit self-effacing. This was a person who was not worse than he said he was, but better. Here is where we reach the nub of what I think separates the hypocrites from the first two situations. In her essay on hypocrisy, Ava Feder-Kitte says that a hypocrite is not just someone who contradicts their words with their actions, but someone who attempts to paint themselves as better than others with their words, while their actions go against this in particular. In effect, it is someone who utters a prescription for other people and then does not follow it themselves. To return to the case of Matt Hancock, he had not just said that he would, as a personal choice, practice social distancing. He had said that it is incumbent upon all of us to socially distance. He framed it as a social responsibility. It was not just a matter of taste, but an imperative delivered to all of us. To borrow an idea from Kant, he was asserting a law of conduct, and then broke that law himself. He had even previously condemned a government advisor for breaking the same rules, calling them deadly serious. This is clearly different to the case of me eating jam sandwiches, because while I may have said that I did not like them, I did not say that it was wrong to eat jam or that anyone who ate jam was some sort of evil strawberry-munching villain. I had only been talking about my personal tastes, which we tend to allow people to change as much as they want. It is also different from the case of Vitalis, because he was not trying to present himself as better, but instead as worse. He was deceptive, but it was not selfish deception, but selfless deception. So, tentatively, it seems like there are a number of components to a hypocritical action. The first is that there must be some sort of contradiction between a statement and a behavior. Some research has also shown that we are more likely to call someone hypocritical when the statement precedes the behavior rather than the other way around. Secondly, the statement must be to present the speaker as better than other people or making a moral prescription, while the behavior must undermine the contents of that statement. Thirdly, there must be no extenuating circumstances that would absolve someone of responsibility for their actions or otherwise interfere with our process of moral attribution. For instance, if I said that people should control their anger and then my entire family was killed in a car crash and as a result I became agitated and shouted at a friend, then sure, I have fulfilled the first two criteria, but there is some degree of extenuating circumstance. In intense grief, we tend to attribute limited responsibility to someone's actions, and thus most people would not call me a hypocrite there, they would just say I was having an extraordinarily bad day. There are many reasons why someone might engage in hypocrisy. A study by Longvist and others argues that the motivation behind a significant portion of our moral behavior is not a genuine desire to be moral, but rather to appear moral to our social peers, or other people who can judge us. That is, they hold that our values are just as much a product of our desire for societal acceptance and freedom from judgment than they are sincerely held moral beliefs that would exist even if there were no one around to watch them. To borrow an example from Plato, this view would hold that if we guaranteed someone freedom from discovery, then the actions they would be willing to commit would increase considerably. If this is true, then a lot of motivation for conscious hypocrisy would be pretty simple. As everyone from Machiavelli to St. Augustine to Nietzsche have pointed out, behavior that goes against social morality is often very lucrative for the individual, provided that they can get away with it. In game theoretic terms, the winning move of the moral game would be to get all the benefits of high moral standing, with none of the drawbacks of actually being bound by moral rules. This is the place the hypocrites can occupy if they are not found out. Though, as we shall see, the motivations and causes for hypocrisy can be much more complicated than this. But it does go some way to explaining why there are so many hypocrites. If you take a rational, purely self-interested agent, then hypocrisy is often the best move for them, provided that they know that they won't be found out. So, that is our definition of hypocrisy. Now, why is it so uniquely irritating? Well, I'm glad you asked. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my Patreon for exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. The ultimate irritant. One of the fascinating things about hypocrisy is that we often condemn it in stronger terms than someone just promoting a bad thing and then doing it. I once knew someone who proclaimed themselves to be a sort of enlightened modern man. He would rail against the notions of traditional gender roles and would not be caught dead expressing outdated ideas about masculinity or the like. He would often condemn people he saw as misogynists without holding back in the slightest. And, in particular, he was an outspoken supporter of movements to help women leave abusive relationships. So it was met with much general shock when he had, allegedly, been incredibly unpleasant towards his own girlfriend, intimidating her into not leaving the house and threatening to ruin her social life if she tried to break up with him. Now, when all of this came out of the woodwork, people were understandably very annoyed by it. But interestingly, they were probably more annoyed than they would have been if he had just said that he wanted to be horrible to his romantic partners and then had done so. The combination of the virtuous outer facade and the viceful private life was so infuriating in a way that is difficult to put into words, but I'm sure that you will recognize if you felt it. Who was he to have made all of these grand proclamations of morality to much social applause when it turned out that all along he had, allegedly, been the complete opposite in private? I am ever so slightly irritated even talking about it. But this raises an interesting philosophical question, because the consequences of his alleged actions, on the face of it, were not affected by his prior statements of virtue. It is unclear that this would have been a better situation if he had never said anything about abusive relationships at all, and undoubtedly his work with the charities he volunteered with probably did do some good. So if anything, the consequences of his alleged facade were positive. The hypocritical situation is better than the non-hypocritical one. So why is it that we care so much about the discrepancy between his statements and his alleged behavior? In Christine McKinnon's article on hypocrisy, she points out that we are very interested in finding out the moral properties of people, intuitively whether or not someone is good or bad or has virtues. Even if you're a die-hard consequentialist, this still makes sense. You can cash out these moral properties dispositionally as likely to do good things or likely to do bad things. So we see someone do or say things that indicate they are good, and we feel comfortable labeling them as a good person who is liable to do good actions. I'm sick of doing air quotes now, so just know that I'm leaving the terms good and bad as undefined. Just plug in whatever ethical theory you fancy. But McKinnon points out this is an incredibly delicate system, because when we are attributing goodness not just to an action but to a person, we are making an inference from what we can see, their statements and actions in the world, to what we cannot see, their mental states. If someone says that they strongly oppose abusive relationships, we think this person is probably pretty kind, or at the very least unlikely to be abusive themselves. But if it were to transpire that their words were not indicative of their mental states, and they did in fact have a high propensity to be rather unpleasant themselves, then this disrupts that inference pattern. It not only means that we could not rely on their words anymore, but the fragile framework that allows us to assign people moral properties is damaged. In effect, trust is destabilized. And we see the importance of trust in other contexts as well. A friend of mine, who is significantly older than me, used to talk about how no one really bothered to lock their doors in her small village growing up. But as soon as there was a robbery, everyone suddenly did. It only takes a small dent in the trust of a community to have truly devastating consequences. And, as Byung-Chul Han has observed, if trust goes, then a society becomes less happy, less close, and ultimately less free, as people become more willing to surveil one another when they feel under threat. Essentially, hypocrisy attacks one of the foundations of our system of social trust. That you can, on balance, believe someone when they say something about themselves, and infer from their actions to who they are inside. When someone is hypocritical, it lets us know that this is not as reliable an inference as it might first have seemed, and it becomes generally much harder to earn people's trust. This is a big blow to any potential community. But given this, it starts to make an awful lot of sense why we would treat hypocrites with such scorn. As we said in the previous section, it is often very rewarding to be a successful hypocrite, and there is thus a very strong natural incentive for people to try their hand at hypocrisy if they think they can get away with it. But these advantages come at a great cost to the community they are a part of, since it threatens to damage the very foundations of moral trust. Thus, it is rational for community members to punish hypocrisy disproportionately to its immediate consequences. Because if hypocrisy were to become universal or even commonplace, then it would spell the end of freedom and happiness in that society. The harsh social punishments then help counter the incentive to be hypocritical, hopefully to the point where a rational agent would not do it. And thus, the only hypocrites would be acting on passion, instinct, or if they had a high enough potential reward that would outweigh the social consequences. I think this goes some way to explaining why we despise hypocrisy so much, even in situations where the hypocritical act itself just does not seem that consequential. However, I also want to build upon this point. Because, I would argue, not all hypocrites are created equal, and while some might provoke a certain level of pity and mistrust, others generate only wrath. 3. Genres of hypocrite. In general language, we tend to lump all hypocrites into one camp and call it a day. But I do think that there are notable differences between types of hypocrisy. And interestingly, these often map onto classic moral distinctions within philosophy that already exist. By looking at this, we can help to explain why we are harsher on some hypocrites than others, and the different attitudes they tend to create in us. The first distinction I want to draw is between what I will call the weak hypocrite and the active hypocrite. I think we've all seen examples of the weak hypocrite around. This is the person who in theory has principles but will bow to pressure without much resistance. I once knew someone who was devoutly religious and as a tenet of his faith swore to consume no alcohol and ideally thought that no one else should either. He saw this as God's will and thus a moral prescription. Yet, as soon as there was some social pressure, normally in the form of a pretty girl, this principle was tossed out the window very quickly. His behavior was pretty straightforwardly hypocritical. He knew it and he felt bad about it, but he simply did not have the courage to stick to his principles. To put it in Aristotelian terms, this person was incontinent. He knew what he wanted to do and yet he could not do it. In this case, because he did not have the bravery to resist social pressure. Other forms of weak hypocrisy might involve the seeming inability to properly control bodily urges, such as when an advocate of monogamous marriage has a one-night stand with a stranger, or someone who looks down on others for their poor health decisions, gives in to temptation and spends a week munching junk food on the sofa. In these cases, it seems like the level of condemnation is going to depend on what caused their incontinence and also the consequences of that incontinence. In the case of the guy I knew who just couldn't resist peer pressure, we tend to have a certain level of sympathy, probably because he was still a teenager and we tend to expect a little bit less from people who aren't already adults in any case. He also displayed a lot of remorse for his actions, and it was clear he did not want to be a hypocrite, he just seemed unable to resist being one. Lastly, the consequences of his hypocrisy were very small and only limited to himself. While we might not trust such a person with anything of major importance, we probably don't expect their behavior to cause disastrous consequences or have wide-ranging effects, since ultimately the only person they have betrayed is themselves. It leaves it open that they might display a lot more courage in their principles if something more important was on the line. On the other hand, the marriage advocate who has a one-night stand displays a far more troubling kind of weakness. Here, they have allowed their bodily urges to override a principle they probably hold much more strongly, and also shows they are willing to betray the person they love out of their incontinence. If part of the reason we condemn hypocrites is because they break the agreement to live by their own stated moral prescriptions, then this breach is far more serious than the one from the teenager. Because of the significance of the offence, there's a sense in which we want to say they should not be this incontinent. However, I would still contrast this type of hypocrisy with active hypocrisy. This would be where the hypocrisy is done knowingly and with the direct intent to deceive. For instance, an affair might begin as a serious example of incontinent hypocrisy done in a moment of passion, but a continual one would have to be committed in cold blood with the considered intention to deceive the rest of the world into thinking that no infidelity is occurring. Both the statements of fidelity and the betrayal of those statements would be considered and premeditated. This seems importantly different to the cases of incontinence, in that now Aristotle would say we are in the territory of conscious vice. It is similar to the distinction between a crime of passion and a planned murder. While we condemn both, the first is often done so in slightly less strong terms, and in its extreme form turns into a defense of temporary insanity, whereas the latter is sometimes invoked to recommend harsher prison sentences and cast more serious aspersions on the offender's character. And again, the seriousness of the action and the significance of the principle breached will also influence how much a particular act of active hypocrisy provokes scorn. I also think there is another confounding variable, the extent to which the person knows they are being hypocritical. We are pretty good at rationalizing our actions as exceptional in order to maintain our own self-image as good people, and this extends to when we are being hypocritical. For instance, say I was constantly going on about how important I thought it was to be kind, and yet it was discovered that I was often very bad-tempered with my friends and my family. This would most likely be labeled as hypocrisy. However, I might also not have even realized my own hypocrisy here. I might make an excuse that this was a good exception to my general rule, or I might protest that I was not being unkind, but simply assertive. And I might not even be consciously lying here. In essence, I would be both deceiving other people, but also deceiving myself. Some ethical theorists might think that this would make me slightly less culpable, and thus we would expect people to heap less scorn on the ignorant hypocrite than the knowing one. However, I don't know to what extent this distinction matters in practice, and it would have to be empirically studied. At the very least, the ignorant hypocrite leaves open the possibility that they would change their behavior if only they registered it as what it was, rather than rationalizing it. To again draw from the world of homicide, it's a bit like the difference between murder and negligent manslaughter. In the first case, it's done willfully, whereas in the second, it is, in some sense, an accident which should have been avoided. At least in some cases. I'm not a lawyer and I'm no expert on manslaughter. Finally, I want to revisit the point from earlier about extenuating circumstances. There may be situations where we are more comfortable with hypocrisy if it is for self-protection or in an exceptional circumstance. For instance, if someone's life was being threatened and they had to act in a hypocritical way to save it, we would normally judge them significantly less harshly, since they are so divorced from everyday situations that their hypocrisy is doing little to no damage to the general bonds of trust we discussed in the last section. Most of our trust relationships are a bit like this. They have implicit contextual factors baked into them. We trust people up to a point and in certain circumstances. For instance, if I were to tell an acquaintance a secret, I would trust them to keep it, but I wouldn't do so if they were being tortured. That is so far out of the context in which the trust was established that it seems irrelevant to that rule. I do not expect them to hold to that rule in that circumstance, and what they do in that circumstance will not affect my confidence in the general principle. At least, certainly not as much as if they just went out and gossiped to a friend about it. Of course, these are just a few of the many nuances in our concept of hypocrisy, and I hope it can largely serve as a starting point to further distinctions and refinements in your own thinking and theories. This is just to show how a lot of well-known ethical distinctions are also relevant to the subject of hypocrisy. But lastly, I want to discuss a proposition put forward by a few different philosophers and thinkers, that hypocrisy is a lot more common than we might think, and that in some circumstances it becomes scarily defensible. 4. The World of Hypocrisy. Shakespeare once famously declared that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. This idea was echoed by Michel de Montaigne when he said that the public world was run through with lies and deceit, with people simply playing the roles that give them the most advantage. And these ideas seem pretty intertwined with hypocrisy. The very word comes from the Greek term hypokrisis, which means to act, as in to act on a stage. So then, this begs the question, to what extent is a certain low-level hypocrisy simply inevitable in our daily lives? For better and for worse. One of the main places most people encounter frustrating hypocrisy is in the workplace. It has almost become a meme online that a large number of businesses will say, "We are one big family," only to turn around and treat their workers quite poorly, or, at the very least, a far cry from how we might treat a family member. The organizational theorist Niels Brunson has argued that, incentives-wise, organizations will benefit the most by having two parallel sets of principles. The first is the sets they use to coordinate action and make decisions in the workplace. This is set up to prioritize efficiency, productivity, and, in most cases, probably profit as well. The second, however, is set up to optimize for their public-facing reputation. So this will prioritize the appearance of kindness, compassion, and moral standing. For Brunson, it is also likely to be quite far removed from the actual decisions the business undertakes. However, this is also the exact recipe for hypocrisy, because the organization is encouraged to say one thing and then do another, to present themselves as better than they are. Brunson sometimes calls this necessary hypocrisy, by which he just means hypocrisy that follows from the incentive structure an organization is immersed in. I think this partly helps explain why people find the public altruistic statements of many companies so irritating. We suspect hypocrisy even if we cannot directly see it. It almost seems like many of us would prefer an honest villain to a slippery weasel. Government structures are another good example. Take the instance of Matt Hancock. In his public-facing role as health secretary, he would have to appear extremely conscientious regarding any rules and guidelines submitted by his department. However, like a lot of people, he found the guidelines inconvenient and separately, allegedly, wanted to have an affair with this woman. The situation was well set up for hypocrisy to emerge because it became rational to have one public-facing set of principles and another private set of principles. Obviously, these are two cases we would consider bad hypocrisy. But a certain low level of hypocrisy might be much more commonplace than we tend to think. To tie this back to the original Greek word meaning to act, it seems like hypocrisy would be pretty likely considering the amount of roles we have to play on a daily basis. We might feel we have to play a different role at work to the one we have at home, or wear slightly different masks in slightly different social circles. To borrow a term from psychology, we use these schemata to navigate the complexities of a modern social life. It would be incredibly fortunate if all of these roles were juggled perfectly without a touch of hypocrisy here and there. I'm not suggesting that we are all awful people or irredeemable hypocrites, just that we have a tendency to wear many different hats. And this has the potential for a certain low-lying hypocrisy to creep in. I also find this interesting because this type of hypocrisy might not even necessarily be a bad thing. It arguably aids in the smooth running of our society. But it does also help us recognize just how ubiquitous these minor hypocritical patterns might be. This same criticism arguably applies to the whole realm of moral condemnation. This idea was made very succinctly by Jesus Christ when he said, "Let he without sin cast the first stone." The assembled company had to admit that they were not without sin and so unworthy to cast moral judgments on the adulterous woman about to be punished. And this is a theme we see throughout the New Testament, what with the injunction to judge not, lest ye yourself be judged. We are constantly reminded that we are all imperfect beings and are not truly fit to stand in moral judgment of one another without engaging in hypocrisy. This task is then left to the Son, who is considered without sin. Now, I am an atheist, but I do think there is a really solid bit of philosophical criticism here. Most people would assent to and assert the proposition a person should do the right thing and avoid doing the wrong thing. Again, leaving the terms right and wrong undefined. Moreover, many of us do condemn people when we perceive that they have done the wrong thing. And yet, I think Jesus was right when he said that we have all done wrong things. Almost all of us have crossed our own values and failed to do what we ought to have done. Hell, if you believe philosophers like Peter Singer, we are all failing in our moral duties in a truly abominable way. To this extent, most of us are engaging in a low-level sort of hypocrisy. We are saying one thing, be moral, and then doing another. On a very broad level, we are condemning others for what we ourselves engage in. Michel de Montaigne found this underlying hypocrisy unbearable, as did others like Nietzsche, who saw it as a resentful and bitter way to live. As a result, they both sought isolation to insulate themselves from the games of pretense that they thought dominated the social sphere. But there is an argument that this background hypocrisy is very much the lesser of two evils for a functioning society. If everyone lived never morally condemning others because we are not morally perfect, then we would avoid hypocrisy. But this may come at the cost of eroding the values of the community we live in, since then no one is enforcing them. So, arguably, we are each presented with a choice. To what extent are we willing to morally condemn others and so leave ourselves open to the charge of hypocrisy? And how do we balance this with the concerns of maintaining the morality of the societies in which we live? Again, this is all aimed to spur your own thinking. To what extent do you think that we live in hypocritical societies, and how much does that bother you? Do you think that a certain level of hypocrisy is inevitable when we make moral judgments about other people while not being free of sin ourselves? In which situations do you think we should be more patient with hypocrisy, and which ones deserve our unmitigated scorn? Ironically, if a certain level of hypocrisy really is commonplace, then when we turn around and condemn hypocrites in the strongest term, decrying it as a cowardly vice, unworthy of our respect or consideration, we may end up stating values that we ourselves do not live up to. But alongside hypocrisy, there is another chief irritant of our modern age: bullshit. And you can check out my video on that right here. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.